My name is Sonia Livingstone. I'm a professor of social psychology in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And as even that introduction shows you, I have a very kind of multidisciplinary background and working context. And I began as a social psychologist thinking about media audiences. And since 1995 or thereabouts, I've been really doing research on children and what we used to call their new media use, when new media meant, do they have a VCR or a TV in their bedroom? But of course, my career has kind of tracked the expansion of, first of all, computing at home and at school, and then more significantly, the rise of the internet, and now what we might call a digital world. So I very much think of my work as trying to make a kind of bridging point between all the different disciplines and fields of study that really do have something to say when they converge on questions of children online. I begin in my own thinking with the seeming and sometimes real contradiction between the words social and psychology, which is how I describe myself, because thinking about the social world and thinking about the psychological world tend to pull us in different directions. And I do very much see social psychology as a bridging point where we try to understand and reflect the experience of individuals and the influences upon them. But we also recognize that individuals live in relationships, children grow up very much in families, in peer groups, embedded in all kinds of social relations. And those social relations have their own structures, shape, traditions, conventions, and then there is the larger societal level that we need to think about too. So those different traditions are very important in my own thinking. And for me, that comes together in a whole series of concepts that I work with. The idea of the audience is individual and social or societal ideas about literacy. We can talk of literate individuals, but also a media literate society. And the specific kind of research traditions that have fed into my thinking then, in addition to the psychological and the sociological, I would also add the tradition of cultural studies, which brings into thinking about media studies, recognition of the importance of culture at all levels, and a political or critical perspective, which always takes us beyond the thinking about just a kind of descriptive or normative account of the of children, and recognize also the imperative and the importance of possible points of change. I think over the last few years or even decades, the social and psychological dimensions of thinking about children online are themselves increasingly pulling apart. So I see questions about the psychology of the individual, including the individual child, pulling more towards the neurological discussion about brains rather than minds. And that kind of takes us ever more into how the individual child might think or be influenced, but gives us a kind of challenge in recognizing the social nature of development and childhood. And I see the social also kind of pulling away. There's been a long-standing repudiation of thinking about the psychological within sociology, which is a challenge, and that gets stronger with the increasingly critical nature of sociological thinking and the desire to address structural imbalances and structural injustices rather than, as it were, think about the individual experience. So I understand why both of those directions are taking place, but I still think it is really crucial that we find ways of bridging, because individuals are both psychological and sociological. And I might just add to that from the digital perspective, the recent and very powerful recognition of the importance of data and the datafication of childhood even takes us away from thinking about the human altogether. And this is a new trend in the kind of latest development of theories and concepts, that very often we're talking about data and we need to remind ourselves that we are also talking about people. I guess for me, a powerful starting point is the theory of late modernity that developed within critical sociology as an effort to recognize the nature of everyday experience, including people's experience, including children's experiences. So something like Anthony Giddens' approach to structure and agency and the importance of thinking about structuration processes, I still find helpful. I recognize this theory has been around for a while, and some folk have moved on, but for me, it still captures the social and the psychological framing of children's experiences in their lives. And particularly in relation to the digital, I find Ulrich Beck's thought about the risk society very fruitful as a way of recognizing how risks are, in a sense, very much linked to technology as well as other things, but emergent from the actions of society and the actions of human beings. And then as a long-standing audience researcher, I'm always fascinated by the way, by thinking about processes of interpretation and, if you like, the kind of interpretive flexibility or the openness to multiple possible meanings of any text, technology, situation. And so I kind of draw on ideas around interpretation that informs my understanding of media literacy or digital literacy today, and the emphasis that I would put on processes of mediation. Indeed, it kind of takes me towards a processual view rather than a kind of a structural view. Probably the biggest area of debate in relation to children online is not so much around children, but around online. And the question of what we really mean by the digital world or the digital environment. There's a lot of confusion, I think, about exactly what we're talking about in relation to technology. So, of course, we come to this when we do our work, knowing that there's been a long-standing critique of talk of technological determinism, a long-standing and still really important recognition of the way in which technological innovation spawns moral panics and anxieties about technological impacts on people. And yet I think we struggle to find another kind of a language. Can we find a language of soft determinism to recognize the power of technology and the kind of affordances of technology? Can we find a way of thinking about what in the social studies of technology they call the kind of assemblage of social and technological processes together? So I think, and then data and datafication adds a kind of new twist to how do we grasp the nature of the online or the technological or the digital. Exactly. I would like us really to stop talking in any kind of simple way about the idea of technological impacts. So to me, impact is the kind of the red flag term that implies an overly causal, overly linear, probably too simple analysis of the way in which children relate to and engage with the digital environment. I don't in any way mean to undermine the idea that technology is powerful, and the technologists, the platforms, the organizations that produce and generate technology, they're all powerful, but impact is too simplistic. And we need to always insert the role of individuals, the role of society, the role of history and culture, and then unpack a more complex process. I think relatedly, particularly in relation to children, I think I'm very wary about the concept of harm. And I'm not worried about it because I don't think it happens, but it's often, it's very important to me that we distinguish risk from harm and think about risk as the probability of harm, which always raises a question about whether or not harm has occurred, as defined by whom, of what severity, and with what kind of evidence to document. So I don't want us to stop talking about harm, but I want us to be much more careful about how we make assumptions about harm. I was trained as a social psychologist to begin with your theory and then operationalize your research questions and produce your findings and then go back to the theory. I think in a very fast changing and multidisciplinary field, the process is much more cyclic and much more entwined and much more iterative than that. I'm increasingly in favor of beginning with definitions. And definitions are, if you like, the simple part of theory, but remarkably difficult. We don't really know in our field when we're talking about children or adolescents or teenagers or youth or young people. We can argue those different terms carry all kinds of assumptions. We get confused about whether we're talking about technology or the online world or social media or everything to do with the internet. So concepts need to come first. And once we've specified just what we're talking about, I think it's much easier to move into empirical research whose scope is clear and whose kind of relevance is something that we can articulate rather than take for granted that we all share the same understanding. But even though that definitional and conceptual work generates, I think, some very productive debates among collaborators or scholars or people working together in a field. I would also say that in our field, we often end our thinking with the empirical findings and perhaps with their relevance for practice and policy. And I think it's important that we do more work to bring it back to theory, because our findings do help us clarify, for example, in research on digital skills, the empirical work we do can help us also clarify and develop theory about digital skills more generally, beyond children. It's relevant beyond children when we do work on children, and perhaps even also to a broader framing of thinking about the digital and about skills or literacies. So we don't always do that work enough. I would love us to do it more, and I would love us to come from the very specific research we do on children online to think and to speak back to all the different disciplines and theoretical bodies of work that we draw on beyond our particular focus. I think there are so many challenges ahead. It's a little dizzy making deciding how to kind of focus. We really do need to think about the importance of data and the way in which data is beginning to pose new concepts and frameworks that we haven't yet kind of aligned very well with our more traditional frameworks around the child. So I'm thinking, for example, about the importance of surveillance in talk of surveillance capitalism or data surveillance. It's a new concept for thinking about children online. It raises lots of new questions about the importance of being observed or unobserved, about the kinds of actors who are relevant and influencing the child's world. Everyone is suddenly thinking much more about privacy and its relation to data, and that takes us from thinking about privacy in the interpersonal space, which we traditionally do for children, and to think much more about privacy in socio-structural terms in relation to the state and in relation to corporations. So I think the digital innovation trends are posing new conceptual challenges for us and raising a lot of difficulties for us in theorizing the digital environment. I think also when scholars in our field try to think about all the different levels that they are working with, we are sometimes a little like the child who writes their address as my street address, my town, my country, the universe, as it were. We draw on a model like that of Bronfenbrenner to kind of put the child in the center and the family around, and then the school, the peers, the country, the culture, and so on. I completely understand why we do that, but for me, it has two real problems. And for me, these are where we need better theories in the future. One is that it always puts an individual child in the center and everyone else is kind of reduced to context, rather than recognizing the truly kind of social and relational nature of development. And the other is that because we always put the child in the centre, we strengthen work on children online, but we don't take the work of children online to other fields for whom the child is not the centre. We kind of bring things back to our framework, but we need to also find ways of putting the child into current thinking about surveillance capitalism, into current thinking about the Internet of Things, into thinking about data ecologies. And I think that's where our theories of the future should show. Where does the child speak to and is relevant as part of the debates that others are having all around us, which generate new insights. I think it's really important when we think about children online that we think about children and the digital world not as a niche topic, but as a point of intersection where different disciplines, different debates, and different tensions are very much focused. And that gives us lots of challenges in terms of being clear on the theories and concepts that we use, because they guide the kind of terms of our empirical work. And I've also argued that it's really important that we bring back from our insights about children in a digital world at a time of radical change, that we bring back the insights from that exploration to exploring the new and emerging trends in the digitalization and datafication of our world, so that children become part of wider thinking across a number of different disciplines.